Hi, everyone. I'm stepping into some very big shoes tonight. The dean was supposed to be here, and then Kyle was supposed to be here. So I'm stepping into two very big shoes. Tonight we're going to hear from a very special person, Larry Davis, who you probably all know very well. He's held many positions in the school over many years. He was the undergraduate chair, I think, 3 times, Larry? 2? Only 2? He was the director of the SU Florence program for 5 years, and he's also the co-founder of CityScripts. I'm also co-founder of CityScripts. And it is an honor to have him as a colleague in that sense, and many others. Larry has probably taught at every level of the undergraduate curriculum, and for many years has taught a seminar on Exurbia. Some of you have probably taken it and heard about it as well. The subject of tonight's lecture, and his recently published book called Rewriting Exurbia, New People in Aging Suburbs. In Aging Sprawl, sorry. It examines the transformative potential of aging post-war suburban sprawl, a condition Larry identifies as being driven by the influx of new cultures and their unique spatial practices. The book highlights design and planning strategies such as hyperlocal zoning, increased residential density, and a broader mix of functions and shared community spaces. Larry has also written numerous book chapters, journal articles, book reviews, and has lectured to both professional and general public audiences in Milan, Mexico City, Madrid, Los Angeles, Indianapolis, Florence, Venice, and here at Syracuse. The book, I think, is probably a significant contribution to both urban and suburban discourse. It is and here I'm getting to the end because I'm all mixed up here. It is an honor to have you speak and to have you as a colleague. Thank you.
Let me get set up here. Is that good? You can hear me? Good. Well, thanks for that very generous introduction, Liz. And it's always, and thanks to you for attending. It's always great to present your work, share your work, get ideas, feedback about it. But particularly to such a familiar audience, it's been a real honor, really, to have my career here. It's such a great school, and to have everybody, colleagues, students, other people outside the profession help me, develop this research, which has taken, quite a few years. As Liz said, the principal topic of my writing, design practice, and much of my teaching has been the present and possible futures of the existing North American, I'm trying to figure out how to use this, North American low density urbanized world. This is supposed to work. Okay, well, does it work? Rewriting Exurbia, New People in Aging Sprawl, released in September of 2024 by ListLab Editore, which is a publisher out of Trento and Barcelona, and distributed here in the US and Canada by SU Press, examines the architectural and urban design potential of new emerging spatial practices in Asian and Latino communities in existing post-war Euro-American suburban and exurban development. By far the most common and popular form of development in the US and Canada. These new and largely informal practices have the potential to be transformative, not just for new residents, but I argue for all residents, including Euro-Americans, for the future form and space of these existing low-density urban cities. Of course, this is threatening to some, mainly white Euro-Americans. But without being naive, the book discusses this and strikes a largely optimistic tone, or tries to, about the potential of these changes. It's been a 10-year project with a mixed methodology, a lot of direct observation, travel to Southern California quite a few times, and Northern California, not as many, but also some important trips there. There's a lot of analysis of secondary sources, a lot of articles and books by sociologists, demographers, cultural geographers, and the popular press. All these people have been writing about this phenomenon over the last few decades. And a handful of architectural and urban design projects that try to address the potential, or the future potential of Exurbia. The third part of this was in the last 2 years an urban design research piece of this, of a team that I led, undergraduate students here who took advantage of the Source Grant Program, which is a great program. Jinyu Tang, who is now just graduated from Cornell and got a graduate degree from there. Chen-Hao Luo, who just is finishing up at the GSD, and Ji Zheng, who is now working in Vancouver, were part of the team in various roles. And I just mentioned there has been a plethora of secondary data on the topic. That said, except for some of the work and some of the writing of Estudio Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman, I felt there was a huge blind spot in the lack of participation by and in the design fields of this part of the built environment. And so while there's quite a bit out there on various informal urbanisms, the favelas of Brazil, or shall we say, East Asia, Southeast Asia, a lot going on there, there's not much about similar transformations occurring in the exurbs of the US and Canada. My book attempts to both, one, illuminate this phenomena to designers and other stakeholders and open a productive discussion about its architectural and urban potential. Before I go any further, though, I want to acknowledge support from the School of Architecture's faculty works grants over various years, as well as the undergraduate source grants program, which I think is an exceptional program here. Not a lot of other schools have that, and it's a great opportunity to work with students on your work, and I think it's a great opportunity for the students too. Okay, so before I get too far into this, I want to define two things. First, the audience. There's quite a bit of academic work and theory that informs the book. Those who know will recognize the texts and ideas by people like Robert Fishman, Margaret Crawford, and Albert Pope, among others, all standing against a horizon painted by philosophers like Henry Lefebvre, in particular his work on the right to the city. That said, the book is more strategy than theory, written from the point of view of an architect or an urban designer or a local policymaker. I believe to have a greater impact, we in academia need to expand our audience so that without losing the sophistication and nuance of what we say or propose, we need to speak in ways that are understood by a wider swath of people. To that end, I try to avoid too many neologisms or theoretical references. That said, I want to emphasize I'm not against this when talking within the discipline. We need to speak this way to gain a certain amount of efficiency, and so it's only natural. The second thing I want to do is define the difference between the term suburbia and exurbia. And admittedly, this is a little squishy. Suburbia is an old term. Remember to switch the slides here. It means outside the center. It's centuries old. Historically, this was not as nice or as prestigious an address as one would find in the center of the city, of course. However, since the late 18th and early 19th century, what would become the leafy Anglo-American suburb was viewed as an asylum to the new kind of family, the nuclear family, to escape the dangers of the growing industrial city. At first, it was a kind of informal urbanism made of renovated farmhouses on the outskirts of London. But by the late 1780s, 1790s, a series of intentional low-density developments, residential developments, began to pop up around London. For example, Clapham Common, southwest of the center of London, was a kind of utopic experiment a retreat for progressives, among them the abolitionist William Wilberforce. The book uses the term suburbia, however, mostly as a colloquialism for a spatial type and pattern that supports the Anglo-American residential lifestyle, one that itself has become an internationally consumed commodity in its various forms and affiliated products. Especially since the Second World War, the vast majority of urbanization of metropolitan regions is in a diffuse format. The result is a dispersed city of simultaneous poles or smaller centers with fields of development in between. This creates a scattered spatial and cultural territory that replaces the historic center-edge binary, a condition that arguably is now extinct. So this newer diffuse form of development is no longer S-U-B, or subordinate to the urban center, and has in many cases replaced the cultural influence of the center. For this reason, I think the prefix X, EX, instead of sub, is more accurate. X can mean many things, from out of, or beyond, or to a separation from a former state of being. So while not perfect, the term exurbia for me not only is more accurate, but is more productive when describing the development of the contemporary and very common diffuse city, one that no longer is defined by a single or hierarchical center. Finally, what I propose in this book is quite compatible with larger top-down, zoomed-out infrastructural planning and design strategies. Namely things like landscape urbanism and other kinds of things that are driven, at really large territorial scales. Think of this almost as the opposite, right? It's tinkering with the DNA of an existing settlement at the closer zoomed-in scale. This to create a flexible and socially responsive future texture of habitation for an existing built environment. This is the racial dot map created by the University of Virginia's geography department. It's based on the 2010 census, U.S. Census, and every dot on this map represents a person, and there are 4 colors, and those are the 4 different races that the census that year identified. The blue dots are white Americans, the green dots are African Americans, the orange dots are Hispanic Americans, that's their term, and the red dots are Asian Americans. This is a close-up just outside of Washington, D.C. in suburban northern Virginia. And what's interesting here is that what had been a kind of, probably in the 50s and 60s, mostly blue dots, let's say, is now quite diverse. And so while this map is certainly flawed, certainly these designations are much more complicated than the kind of reductive nomenclature that they use for the U.S. Census, it still illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. And the contention of the book, that a previously ethnically and culturally homogeneous type of built environment is now becoming, or already has become, heterogeneous. This troubles many, but as I see it, it's a very positive opportunity for healthy transformation. The book starts by giving a bit of context through a brief review of exurban history, culture, and a small set of relevant theories about the low-density city since the 1960s. The first is the post-war vernacular built environment that emerged from the scale of the car, in particular theories by Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisenhower in their work on Las Vegas. Their work is interesting because it's associated with the somewhat ironic postmodern framing of the burbs as a culturally empty space. We now know this is a bit cliche, getting old and per evidence, and I can say from my personal experience, not particularly accurate. The burbs have long been a place of cultural production. Whether that range from, let's say, the garage band of the punk rock era of the late 70s and the early 80s to the famous, or shall we say infamous by now these days, startup garages in the Silicon Valley, right? It's amazing how important what came out of that built environment. But I'm not claiming that it came because of that built environment. Still, it was a culturally productive place. This is not an original posture. Urban writers that accept the culture and describe this form include people like Rainer Banham and his discussions about, or his description of LA as four ecologies, sort of interweaving and threaded together. Loris Larup looks at Houston. These are a couple of drawings of this. He imagines development as these huge weather fronts crashing into one another over the prairies of Texas. Both use a kind of ecological paradigm to describe the contemporary sprawl cities of LA and Houston, respectively. The book then positions recent changes to sprawl cities with change in all types of urban form and space across history. Such transformations are based on the interaction of various material, technical, cultural, and ideological change through various historic periods of any city. Oops. This happens naturally to any city, as I said, over many decades and centuries, even millennia. Those students who were in Florence, for instance. I mean, Florence was a Roman city, then it was a medieval city, then it was a Renaissance city, then it was the new capital of the new republic in the mid-19th century, now it's a tourist city. They go through these cycles. And I would say modern sprawl is not immune from this. This kind of evolution, and is arguably at the end of its first life. So it is, in fact, poised for change, especially now with the arrival of new people with new spatial practices. We should not at all be surprised now how aging exurbs, like any cities, are beginning to transform. Of course, others have already tried to imagine a different kind of exurbia. Perhaps the best known approach to this is through a kind of retrofit or remediation that relies on historic and physically compact European city models and their derivatives, such as the Euro-American small town of the 19th and early 20th century. I argue this is a bit nostalgic and does not accommodate the identity of other cultures. The book then goes on to examine who actually is now living in these existing built environments, and then offers a sample survey of some of their new spatial practices. So, so the key and generative subject of the book is based on two sources: demographic data, and particularly that by William Frank, who's a demographer for the Brookings Institute. He's written a lot. He's tracked, using the categories of the U.S. Census Bureau. Changes in this case, the percent of people living in the exurbs, and in this case, the percentage of change in the center cities versus the exurbs. You can see it's incredibly high, comparatively speaking, and even in all demographic groups. Actually, there's a slight dip in Euro-Americans in the last census, and they moved to the center city. Also, as I said before, a series of sociological studies, studies by sociologists, anthropologists, and cultural geographers in the last 24 years on what is termed as ethnoburbs. And this is a term coined by the sociologist Wei Li. And it's defined as a large concentration of a specific ethnic minority group living in a suburban area. So especially as an architectural designer, I'm interested in the culturally driven spatial practices of these newer residents. And these include the transformation of existing building typologies in a formal, functional, and symbolic way. And in this case, it's just in a kind of functional and symbolic way. It's a food stand, but now, of course, serving and displaying a different cultural identity. But also in looking at the space around the house or the residence, which is a fundamental feature of the traditional suburb, and seeing how combining how this has changed with the changes that are happening with the other typology, the commercial typology that I just showed you, begin to speak to a new kind of physical, functional, and cultural texture. The open lawn, I think, is particularly interesting to look at. This is a kitchen restaurant, a drawing of a kitchen restaurant by my team called Bajitan. It's in Corona, California, in Riverside County, which is the Inland Empire, about an hour or so to the east of downtown LA. And what's interesting is a practice that had been kind of under the radar for a few decades. was now, once you get enough electoral traction and you can change local zoning laws, right, is now allowed. And so these small kind of informal kitchen restaurants, in this case also in the center block, are now, you know, legit. They are, you know, they're subject to health inspections and everything else that you would do to have a good, kind of healthy, safe restaurant. But they also begin to sort of open up a space that, in the past that had been private, now making it more public. And I think this is a really important thing to look at and begin to consider as a strategy. The other thing is how the front yards are used differently, and particularly, again, more often in Latino ethnoburbs than in Asian ethnoburbs. Susan talked all day. I was on a review. But anyway, you know, the front lawn, we usually see it as this kind of scenographic, you know, garden that, you know, constructs privacy and frames the house, the individual propriety of the house. But it now operates differently in culturally and symbolic ways, but also in the process introduces a more complex range of informal, often social functions. So here you can see sort of informal retail or a daycare or, you know, like an intense Latino garden. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And a kind of different decorative sensibility for sure. But it's a kind of social space, almost like we would use a porch in the previous generation. This is a taxonomy done by the research team that looks at all sorts of different possibilities for the front lawn and even the back lawn, and then a composite drawing of what it might look like if they were all put together in one block and how that begins to transform the texture of this particular neighborhood or a neighborhood like this. The book also looks at a set of Asian ethnoburbs. This one in northern Orange County is the Vietnamese ethnoburb of Westminster. And the red dots in the middle is the Vietnamese community of Westminster. This is Santa Ana, and to the west is Seal Beach. Just to give you a little bit of orientation. This is also the largest Vietnamese community outside Vietnam. Vietnamese began arriving here at the end of the Vietnam-American War in the mid-1970s, just as Euro-Americans began leaving this Levittown-like development that was built actually in the late 50s and 60s, just as they were leaving this area for places like Irvine or San Diego or places like that. It's interesting to see what they did to the sort of typical house here. Here you can see what had been actually a 1,500 square foot house is now much larger, and also a kind of different decorative sensibility is applied to the roof line, you know, with the fennials coming out, the Southeast Asian fennials coming out on either side. It's a very common pattern. What's interesting too is what they keep, I think. We should all notice that. In particular, the car culture. There's a huge kind of street racing culture in that area. But you know, also at the same time, it's important to recognize there's a great car culture in Latino culture with low rider production, which actually began after the Second World War in Espanola, New Mexico, if you believe the legend. But the houses, again, in Westminster are kept. They aren't torn down. They're transformed. They're modified and changed symbolically in order to create a sort of reference to Southeast Asia. They also borrow other kinds of Southeast Asian spatial patterns, like this front entry porch, which creates a sort of transition from the street into the house. It's again a common pattern that you find in Vietnam as well as other countries in that area. And here is a drawing, again, of a kind of taxonomy of those things. You can see a series of different additions made. It's interesting that these are done because they are interested in accommodating what's often an extended family culture. So the original 1,500 square foot homes were not big enough. and of course a different sensibility about gardens and entry sequences and creating a kind of front court you can see in the bottom right example. The other thing that's super interesting about the commercial built environment is the commercial built environment and how it's transformed. This is Slocum Mall, which translates to fortune, prosperity, and longevity. It's also known across the region in Southern California as the Asia Garden Mall, for those of you who are from there. And it was really a converted dying mall at the time that holds smaller, family-owned, culturally specific businesses, and also features a series of shared programs like this tower shrine at the entry. There's also a performance space in the back, and you'll see in a minute the parking lot has also changed. What's interesting about the shrine is that it's a pattern that was borrowed or transposed from a typical Asian city market, where there's often a shrine or a temple at the head of the market or one end of the market, to make for a more prosperous and fortunate environment for all the commercial activities there. And so they begin, why not put it in their new center as well? The parking lot, too, also serves as an informal, popular town square and is the site of regular community events, such as the Tet Festival, which is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, and regular night markets. Here is a drawing of it. You can see the different public functions that are within the spine of the mall, the shrine, the food court, and this performance space, and then a parking lot at the bottom of the drawing. It's important to note that the it's important to note that the American suburban lifestyle is an internationally consumed commodity, the appetite of which was originally driven by several decades of internationally consumed media, film, and TV on the topic. Suburbia is not just a physical place, but a psychological space, and as such has become a kind of commodified idea. Examples include this on the right is Jujun, or Orange County. It's a suburb, an American-style suburb, 30 miles north of Beijing. These are all over, again, Asia and South Asia, South America. I've even seen a kind of American-style suburb outside of Madrid. And so this is something, it's something that's marketable, something that people want, and so, of course, developers offer it as a kind of offer among the many in any given urban area. Of course, when newcomers come to the United States, oftentimes with a lot of money and a lot of commercial ambition, they want to build their own version of the American dream that they saw before they got here. This is the racial dot map of it's Mission San Jose, which is in Fremont, California, which is the southeast part of San Francisco Bay Area. Silicon Valley is over to the left here, Cupertino, Palo Alto, Los Altos, places like that. And of course, a great place for anyone immigrating who has the resources to start a great business and really maybe even make connections globally to sort of supply the business. A lot of people like that. And so this became a kind of landing place for affluent Korean and Chinese immigrants beginning in the late 1980s. They came here because they had excellent schools, but not because of the housing stock, which they considered to be too small in this region. And so this is an example of getting, again, enough electoral traction to change the zoning laws to go from, say, an FAR that permitted something in the neighborhood of 2,500 square foot per lot to now something much larger, which permitted 5,000 square feet per lot, doubling the FAR. What's interesting here is that the size and the kind of introverted nature of the house is very different than what was in the previous homes in this exact spot, but also that these were done in order to make a more kind of conspicuous representation of their success. So part of the American dream, of course, was showing that you were a successful commercial person. So as an architect, I mean, if you look at all these together, I'm interested in asking what this can mean for those who can consciously design the built environment, and how designers might interpret this documentation as a set of transformative strategies to create new types of exurban settlement patterns. This means in the future there can be, as Margaret Crawford suggests, not just one type of suburbia, but many kinds of suburbias across the larger low-density exurban city. So the challenge becomes how to make a new theory and find or write new narratives for these new suburbias that make up the larger territorial scale polycentric diffuse city. These informal examples inspire the book's attempt to identify more autonomous strategies or systems architects can use to imagine new life for aging Euro-American sprawl. This is where the art comes in. This is the second speculative phase of the research. The first step is to understand and reconsider the current state of the surface, this kind of two-dimensional poche, the most ubiquitous aspect, I think, of what we understand as the Euro-American suburb. From there, the idea is to make the surface more urban, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but at the moment, of course, it's anything but urban, right? It separates us, it frames things, it constructs privacy. This is done by making it more functionally complex. And you can see on the left is sort of the way, as a figure ground of the surface, how the lawn operates in a typical suburban street, right? Separating and connecting at the same time. There's still a kind of thing that doesn't allow things to interact. And on the right is a very famous drawing by Alex Wall for OMA scheme to La Villette, Park La Villette in the 1980s. And what's interesting here is that you have a kind of two-dimensional system that is functionally interchangeable, more social, and much more complex. So the opportunities really for social interaction increase. For me, these strategies are best described by Sebastian Moreau and Alex Bald, whose readings on OMA's scheme and others from that era try to thicken the surface in order to enhance the social interaction that might happen. This is accomplished mainly through the complication of program, the introduction of complicated programs. I suggest there can be an additional means to do this by also culturally thickening the surface, as well as introducing a more complex palette of functions. This is done mainly by using diverse readings of nature and the garden to complicate and thicken the function, expression, and cultural identity of the exurban surface. It's important to note that on one hand, nature is understood, of course, scientifically as a set of interactive biological systems, right? That's a tree. It's a tree in any culture. But nature is also something that operates culturally. This means nature is interpreted as a background to larger, shared, and usually poetic and often sacred meta-narratives. These vary quite a bit from culture to culture. So, the lawn and nature in the Anglo-American suburb that emerged out of London was a kind of reconstruction, a virtuous reconstruction of Eden, right? Where you put your, nuclear family, keep them safe, right? But, if you permit me to generalize, in many Asian cultures, they view nature as a kind of continuum in which humans are part of and attempt to seek balance with nature. And there's an example of a kind of Asian-based landscape firm in San Diego. And then they specialize in this. And on the right, a more kind of homegrown Latino kind of landscape and garden with the Virgin of Guadalupe shrine there at the end. And again, the kind of Latino landscaping sensibilities, a kind of mix of Mesoamerican and Catholic, colonial Catholic ideas, oftentimes using. The Catholics were good at creating intercessors. The Virgin of Guadalupe was supposed to be a woman trampling snakes, right? Which was supposed to be good for the harvest. But anyway, it's a kind of animated with animals and plants and saints and things like this, and represent the different aspects of the universe and human temperament. Plants are also used to do this as well. One's immediate ancestors or relatives are often symbolized in specific plants, so that they're there with you every day. it sort of assuages grief, but also sort of comforts you. I think it's a beautiful idea, actually. This project, Living Rooms at the Border, finished in 2020 in San Ysidro, California by Cruz and Foreman, exemplifies this. In addition to program Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman, the Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman project also reconnects previously disconnected streets across its formerly private center block. And here you can see the kind of plan of that. There's a street here and a street here with these strips of passage with different kinds of surface treatments and then different social programs in between there. So there's a kind of densification of both the surface, but also and a complication of the function of these two places. Let's see. I went back. Okay. Well, I skipped over this slide. This slide is interesting too because what they're doing there in San Ysidro is sort of stitching together or remaking or reconstructing a labyrinth in a place that didn't have it. These are two diagrams from Alfred Pope. On the left is his really famous ladders diagram, and he argues that the cities like Houston are constructed in ways that sort of reinforce privacy, and so they have sort of one access point into a neighborhood, hence this kind of ladder structure on the left. And on the right, in contrast, is the kind of more traditional labyrinthian structure of the city. And that's been lost and, in fact, intentionally been repressed in a lot of suburban developments. And so his idea is to reintroduce that. And so one of the interesting things about the San Ysidro project is that it's an example of trying to reintroduce that in a place that didn't have it. There are some other examples I look at for the book to consider, or for you to consider in the book. On the left is Mary Tepper's scheme for Levittown. And it was interesting because she introduces a spine of ADUs, and this increases the residential density of a place that had just single-family homes, but also sort of complicates, you can see the space between the homes. On the right is a place called Blaze Center. It's a community for at-risk youth, and it's designed by a firm called Bent Architects in Melbourne, and they really focus on reconsidering the surface in the center block, and of course it's surrounded by some residential pieces as well as other social functions. They also did this really interesting project called Living Places, which is housing for numerous household configurations with particular attention to residents as they age. And so again, the surface comes in many scales and does many things, and it's something that sort of weaves in and out between the units and the different spaces outside of the units to stitch together the community in a really interesting way. These projects and observations and secondary source research informed the second part of the design research project, executed again by the design team that I spoke of before. It's really a series of experiments, and I really want to emphasize the word experiment here. It uses an existing Levittown in Willingboro, just east of Philadelphia, and for two reasons. One, it's not on the West Coast. We were interested in seeing what the possibilities were of maybe trying to develop a series of autonomous strategies that we learned from these examples that I just showed you. And two, it was very, very well documented. The Delft Dash sort of housing research project used it as a subject in the early 2010s, and so there's a lot of documentation of it, so it was really very helpful. So, a couple of things were to complicate the zoning. That was the first thing, maybe at a larger scale. The zoning is typical, is illustrated typically by what you see on the left, a sort of residential, commercial, institutional, and open space, shared space, sort of patches that never interact with one another. And so we suggested, why don't we use an alternative? There could be a kind of random introduction of what's called hyperlocal zoning at different scales throughout the community. And this might be a way, the first step to sort of triggering something happening that would make this area more urban. The first thing you do after that is to begin to rethink the lot. Here you can see the typical lot as it is now on the top left, and by mixing and matching and chopping and splicing things in different ways and then introducing different kinds of volumes, you can begin to see that you can create a lot of different varieties of textures, introducing different functions, and this gave us a kind of menu of opportunities that we could explore. Last thing was, of course, creating some sort of hypothetical programming that could happen either on the ground floor or in the center block that would be activated in part by the surface, but also introduced into a kind of environment now that is increased residential density, but also, again, functional complexity. And then what we have here at the end are a series of kind of prototypes that we could use, mix and match. Some are 2 blocks, some are 2 lots, and some are 4 lots. And this begins to sort of open up possibilities. One thing we did respect that was already there was more or less the setback, because we did want to connect with the existing built environment that was there. What's I think also interesting is that this could happen more haphazardly. So some houses might remain, people might want to keep their single family home, but others would, maybe sell them to somebody, maybe an extended family that wants to create a larger extended family compound or other kind of domestic unit. It's very flexible. But I think, again, the most important sort of first step is really understanding that the surface is no longer this kind of scenographic surface that constructs privacy, but is now an arena of social engagement that triggers a whole new way to occupy the exurban city. And here is a kind of hypothetical floor plan of a several block area and what might begin. I think what's interesting, particularly too, when you consider, what Albert Poetry does is sort of reintroducing the labyrinth, is that now we have this kind of informal, organic pedestrian labyrinth that might begin to weave through the blocks from street to street across the center of the blocks. And here's just a couple of perspectives of that were done by the team. Really great work. Anyway, to conclude, I just want to talk a little bit about the potential of this. Well, I want to end on a larger cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural aspiration for the book. The book is a kind of research that can be seen in some ways as an example of how to create new social and urban narratives. Specifically, it focuses on finding and enhancing spatial practices that emerge from our current era of widespread global migration. As we see almost daily, there is growing, and I feel, irrational resistance to these social changes to such mass movement. Unfortunately, the perceived threat posed by newcomers often generates anxiety, and in some cases, really tragically violence. This said, we must remember that such unease is a common reaction when preserving deeply ingrained meta-narratives and related shared material practices. In other words, the conventional ways we think about and interact with the built environment are so deeply embedded in our collective social subconsciousness that we hardly notice how they shape our daily lives. As a result, these culturally ingrained narratives are often difficult to change. To shift this, we need to both identify shared experiences across cultures and imagine how to be open to new ways of defining ourselves. This suggests creating new narratives, especially in shared spaces. Of course, other forms of cultural production also need to create new narratives as well, but this is key. When done effectively, this kind of spatial imagination can help us adapt to and enrich our daily lives while also in the process reshape our collective identities in socially healthy ways. So thank you very much. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about these ideas, and hope you enjoyed the
Okay. I guess there are chairs here. Yes. Okay, I don't need this, I guess. Well, I have a couple of questions to start, and then we'll take questions from all of you. So hold on just a second, okay? Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
For a really interesting presentation, and I think engenders many kind of questions. I want to start with one that perhaps is larger than your research specifically, and then I'll talk about that. Talk about the Exurbia and the way in which you're thinking about its evolution. But it occurred to me that over the course, do you guys? Oh, you need it for that thing? I can do this. Yeah, there. Sorry, I forgot. It occurred to me that over the course of many years in this school, that issues of urbanity, exurbia, have largely vanished from the discourse. Your discussion, I think, is a clear call for understanding growth patterns as they have emerged over the last, 50 years or so, I guess. Whereas there were many people, at least when I got here, that looked at cities in lots of different ways. I think we're probably the only two that still do that on a regular basis. How do you understand that shift, and how do you think about its loss, and perhaps how we, and if we should, kind of re-engage in that discussion in a more purposeful way?
Well, it's a good question. I think architecture is many things. I think it's really an art that's informed by the specificity of site, and of course, the site often is a kind of larger collective site, and we can debate on what the city is or isn't. But I think understanding that site, because you get a lot of influence and sort of strength in good architectural design from the site, needs to be understood. I think it's really hard to teach that because it's so complex. I mean, you have 1,000 things you could consider or points of departure. And I think that the real art of teaching it is sort of, to somebody who hasn't done it before, is to really sort of boil things down to some, 2 or 3, 4, 5, whatever issues as a point of departure, and really using those to drive architecture. So they develop an appreciation for that. So certainly the next time they do it, maybe not until after they get out of school, but they'll understand that they have to comprehend or try to comprehend the complexity of the larger site. And cities and any kind of collective built environment are super complex. It's tough because you're starting from scratch. People come out of high school with some really brilliant students, but they haven't designed a building yet. And now you have to also then design a building and part of the city. It gets pretty tricky, and there's a real art to sort of how one introduces it in ways that help them, gain confidence and develop the necessary aptitudes to do really well in that, and to think intellectually, of course, about that, critically.
But I think, for me, I think it's more about the politics of the city, the politics of architecture and the city, or the politics of Exurbia in relation to that, and thinking about what we do as part of that larger aspect of not necessarily always just design, but the way we operate as citizens and architects in a larger way.
Yeah, I think the politics also can get pretty complicated. And again, how we, at what scale and how we frame that and how we show examples of how it informs architecture and or the building in a larger context, I think is a really important thing to do, but it's a challenging thing to do. And we've been working on city scripts for so long, and we do these designs and we show the community, and it's really difficult to sort of communicate to the larger community what we're doing, or what, how expertise in something could matter. And so part of it, is political, is learning how to be persuasive and being able to be articulate enough to describe why this strategy or that strategy might matter. So it's first of all, you have to understand the strategy, but second, you have to understand that maybe the audience needs to be brought up to speed. And again, this is a super complicated thing to teach. And I'm not saying we don't do it, but I think how we sort of craft the pedagogy to do that is a really important thing to discuss.
Okay, so let's get back to your talk. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the work that you showed, or the instances that you showed of new patterns of growth, is that a lot of it seemed to me to be organic, that you're advocating for the freedom to use and change space and change the nature of public and private environments in ways that are maybe not permitted now. So the relationship between organic growth and zoning, maybe, or legislation generally, can be a kind of tense one, right?
It's tricky.
And you might, in an extreme way, argue for the elimination of zoning altogether in order to make a new pattern possible that is really the product of new culture. If you legislate it too much, or you try to encourage it too much, it might also get in the way. So how do you think about the construction of that balance?
It's a really interesting question, and in California right now, which is actually where most of my examples are, it's playing out in rather dramatic fashion, because there's a lot of these examples I showed you today were sort of against the law, right, under the radar, and they just sort of happened, as you said, organically. California at the same time has this big housing crisis, right, and so they've been trying to do all this top-down legislation since I think since 2017. There was another law in 2021. The first one was saying it's mandatory. Anybody who wants to build an ADU across the street can build an auxiliary dwelling unit in the back. The other one was anybody who wants to take their, quarter-acre lot and divide it into 2 lots, they can do that too. There's been a lot of local resistance to that. They've gone to court. People have gotten together at a local level and say this is against the character of our community. And so they've actually won. And so this attempt to try and create a missing middle is a phrase that's being often batted around as a way of trying to address the housing crisis is just being kind of, suffocated, right? It's being stopped. What's interesting about these things is that these were sort of practices that were already there. People say, well, they're okay. And when you get enough, consensus in a community at the local level, not the state level, you can make those changes. So, and in fact, a lot of times those happen at the hyperlocal level, block by block by block. And so the great thing about hyperlocal zoning, it doesn't usually meet that much political resistance, And so everybody more or less agrees that, no, this is the direction we want to go. So I think that's the political dimension, actually, of it, right? And so, again, a lot of these It's a real kind of stew of issues that are happening right now in California that everybody should pay attention to. These kind of organic things that my book more or less focuses on. But my more recent research, I gave a paper last summer in Barcelona about, the kind of failure, if you will, of this top-down effort at the state level to try and create, more housing, more residential density. It's interesting too. The huge fire that happened in January. I just wrote a kind of op-ed piece that basically talks about paying attention to some of the things that I just showed you as maybe opportunities for people to still stay in a new neighborhood, perhaps if they're underinsured or they're maybe having other people come and live on the property, maybe expanding it to make it more residentially dense or functionally complicated. So it's a kind of interesting moment for that city particularly, but I think that city also sort of is a bellwether for other kind of exurban cities, so it's really worth paying attention to.
So is there a too dense Exurbia?
It's what people want, really. I think that I think the one element of Exurbia that needs to be sort of seen as common frequently is nature. And again, you can understand nature in a very scientific way, but of course we read it in cultural ways. And nature is an extremely popular ingredient in any sort of suburban or exurban development around the world. So it doesn't matter what culture you're from. It's like geometry, right? Geometry is almost in every architecture. Nature is almost in every architecture or any kind of suburban residential, suburban low density, medium density city.
So the examples that you showed though were always a more public, a more dense, a more or a less grassy environment, right?
Right.
But that's what people. I think you make a case for that's what people move to the suburbs for grass, for privacy, for.
But I guess to answer your question, it depends on how much in that community, how much grass they want, or how much, they can determine, the balance in their own kind of discourse, I suppose. I think the interesting thing here, though, and Teddy Cruz talks about this, is that his definition of urbanity isn't necessarily sort of compact urban format we usually think of it, but his definition is a density of social interaction. So what this does is it tends towards a more urban or level of social interaction, a higher level of social interaction. So that makes it, quote unquote, more urban, not necessarily more built form.
Okay.
That's debatable. What's the definition of urbanity or urbanness? But I think that's a pretty interesting one that drives a lot of this research here.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to whoever would like to ask questions. Raise your hand. Yeah.
Awesome.
You have to use this thing because we're on mic.
So thanks so much for your introduction. In your book, you talk about California communities like Orange County, as well as the Levittown in the East Coast, like this diagram shows. But Levittown is, as far as I know, the major residence group are African Americans, while Orange County is maybe mix of European Americans and also Asian Americans. So, what's the similarities between the exurban narrative between these East Coast and West Coast communities, and how do you find the connections between these very different?
That's a good question. I intentionally wanted to try these more autonomous, and I use that word in quotes, because again, it's something we can debate. These strategies that we sort of developed after looking at these sort of more organic examples, not in California, because California right now, I think, is this amazing kind of intersection of a lot of different cultural influences the East Coast, for lack of a better term, seems to be more fixed. So what happens if we try to introduce these things to sort of make it a little more relaxed and maybe give it an ability to transform? Maybe speak to things like the housing crisis, increased social interaction and things like that. So that was the real motivation for choosing this, as well as, again, we had a lot of documentation. But California is a really interesting. A lot of people are like, why aren't you looking at Syracuse suburbs? Because that's not where the organic examples are right now. Now that could change. There's no reason why it couldn't. And again, here's another important point. It speaks a little bit to what Liz was saying. I think we look at sort of organic or vernacular architecture, whatever you want to call it, and we're conscious about what we do. We're architects. The first day we went to architecture school, we decided we were going to be deliberate about what we're doing. So we're looking at stuff for people who are perhaps less conscious about what they're doing. I don't mean that they're not. They're conscious about what they're making, but not necessarily any kind of design strategies or larger principles. But my point is we can learn from those and then sort of offer them as solutions to the larger public. I think we owe that to the world to sort of look at that and create new information. That's what's so important about design research, because it's not so much that's going to get built. I don't know, maybe. What's really important is it's going to start a conversation, and you should always sort of try to, when you can, engage in design research, and then try and share that research with the broader public so it stimulates conversation. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had so far with this are, a guy who was a software developer in Boston, another guy who was, anyway, they do other things, and they go, oh wow, this kind of opened up my mind about that. Because people, as I said before, are sort of locked into subconsciously the way things are. People don't want this. Well, they don't solve an alternative, right? So,
reminds me.
Question.
Hold on. It reminds me of somebody once said that America's great contribution to the study of urbanity was the suburbs. But now I think it might be the reinvention of the suburbs.
Yeah, I hope other people have their version of this. I think that would be fantastic.
So thank you for the talk. It was very nice to see what you've been working on and chatting with us about in the last while. I'm struck by the cultural specificity of so many of the phenomena that you observe, and wondering, when you find, as we all do, yourself in this moment right now, that I'm not sure I'm going to be very articulate about, but the kind of truly ferocious backlash to the sort of very post-supremacist coded way in which people are reacting to, whether it's systems of education, systems of like economic systems, etc. Do you? And I don't think the fact of it has taken people completely by surprise. But I know as an immigrant to this country, the ferocity of it and the degree to which lots of people seem perfectly fine with it has taken me aback. So I'm wondering, as a design researcher, what parts of this do you fear, maybe, or has any of your thinking on this turned in recent months? Because it feels very much like you've described a trajectory, and I'm just sort of wondering, are we at an inflection point in this trajectory?
I think any kind of trajectory is uneven and takes decades, really, and maybe even longer to materialize. Cities, the sine curve on city transformation is decades long. So, and it's uneven, it's patchy for sure. I think some places. This is why I'm leaning towards more local solutions than kind of top-down solutions, because I think certain places you'll get the kind of political consensus to make that transformation, and other places you'll have people really digging their heels and saying, what the heck are you doing? I mean, I've shown this to some of my more conservative family members, and they don't like it. I'll say it like that. How could you do this? what are you thinking? But, you know, and then you try to explain why design researchers, they don't want to hear that either. You know, that doesn't mean you don't put it out there. Who knows? Maybe the book sits on the shelf for 30 years and then somebody opens it up. Oh, wow, you know, now it's the time. And maybe it's not the time or the place to do some of this stuff. I'm not that afraid. I'm more afraid of not doing it. I'll say it that way. I was really, one of my big motivators was to say, like, you know, I don't think anybody's done this yet. We need to start this conversation. I'm sure some people could do it better. I'm not worried about that. I'm sure there's things I've left out, nuances I've left out that need to be introduced into the conversation. But if we don't do it, and, you know, it'll play out the way it plays out because things are bigger than anyone here in this room probably. That's going to happen, but we have a responsibility to at least do it and show it and, you know, put it somewhere where people can access it. So I think that's, again, another big value of design research, even though the design might not get built. Certainly within art. I think here's another kind of thing we should do is we need to do a better job of selling what we do to the rest of the world. Because we really affect everybody's everyday life. And we're not, you know, on the news we have, 10 minutes of sports? We have 0 minutes of architecture. We should have 5 minutes of architecture every evening on the evening news. Now, I'm not going to agree with every single piece they show, but at least they're having the conversation.
What a thought. Well, first of all, congratulations, Larry, for completing such a serious effort and for the outcome, and thanks for this evening. You mentioned a number of times that instances that are seem most relevant to you were the term you used was organic, you know, a kind of population, a certain demographic accumulates in a place and that precipitates change, and also that top-down say implementations of policy not
successful.
Yeah.
I don't know if I disagree with them, but I would say they're not successful.
Are there any examples that you're aware of, whether, well, I guess especially in North America, but it could be elsewhere, where the crisis of housing affordability is starting to push equivalent or approaching equivalent transformations?
Well, I think for whatever reason, California seems to be the place that takes the most risks. I would say the most interesting experiments in that are happening at the local level. Of course, as I explained, the sort of state level initiatives are not going so well. It's interesting too that, I mean, the other thing about this kind of change and transformation, it's easier to happen in a kind of looser built environment where it's not so sort of filled out, let's say. I mean, there are certainly ethnic neighborhoods in places like Newark all across the East Coast, right? But they're usually in much more kind of fixed built environments. So one of the advantages of this is the kind of looseness. But for some, Arizona, there's some happening, and some in Oregon a little bit. And I mean, there's whole areas that didn't talk so much about, like with South Asia. There's a place called Yuba City outside of Sacramento, which is an Indian community, and they tend to have these huge, giant, extended family houses that they're building from scratch. I would love to go. I need to go up there and see those. But one of the problems, I think, is the fact that most development is happening at sort of huge scales, at big patches, that you get a giant loan from a bank working with the developer, maybe some multinational sort of bank or something like that. And so the ability to sort of change this too is limited. What's, I think, again, interesting about this, and it tends to happen in sometimes neighborhoods that are sort of in decline, losing their value, although that's not happening anymore, is that they can happen at smaller scales, just 2 lots, 1 lot. And I think that's really also, I'm enough of a populist to sort of really like that. I mean, the fact that you don't have to have some big developer package to build whatever the housing solution that you need. But I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, let me follow up So it seems like there, and it's not surprising, right, that the conflict can rise between the concerns of local population, especially for things like property value, which of course is deeply, deeply ingrained, on one hand, and on the other, even local government initiatives to change zoning, for example. Do you, if you're not aware of examples yet, do you foresee that housing affordability might kind of tip that balance, or do you think that?
Yeah, I think it's going to force people to be inventive. Probably, you're right, and maybe in places not just in California, but maybe the Northeast, which is the second most expensive region. Mm-hmm. There's some interesting shaking and baking happening in suburban Boston these days about similar kind of issues. They want to change the zoning, and there's a lot of resistance. I think Newton, a suburb of Boston.
Well, the debate all over the U.S. about ADUs is exactly that, right? Where many families, because housing costs are high and inflation is challenging everybody, want to build in their backyards, want to build units that they can rent. And the pushback is always, well, there are going to be more kids, there's going to be more use of water, the schools are going to be stressed, the reservoirs are going to be stressed. Where are those people going to come from, right? Who are they that are going to occupy and densify these neighborhoods?
Yeah, and that's the conflict.
And that's the conflict.
Yeah.
So it's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's here in Syracuse too. It's going to affect everyone sooner or later.
Well, my question was, is it affecting? My question is does the effect, when do you think the effect constitutes enough pressure to actually, the question is, when do you foresee a time when the pressure on housing affordability and availability tips that balance so that,
I need to work with political scientists and economists to answer that question, probably. It's hard. I mean, and I think it's happening in very kind of patchy ways.
That would be a great, just an aside, that would be a great project proposal. I'm not sure who would fund it, but, pairing architects.
Now, no one.
Yeah, that's very funny on everything I haven't
Foundations, not the government. Pairing architects with political scientists and/or economists, etc.
Well, let me add my congratulations on the publication of your work. I think it's really fascinating. And I want to wish you good luck, too.
Thanks.
In selling it.
Yeah, I have my football on.
Which leads me to the question of, it would seem to me that one way that this kind of proposition could be put into effect would be to start with kind of a blank slate. Some site somewhere where the project is developed around the principles of Exurbia, and then allow that to serve as an attractor to those people who are willing to adapt to that kind of an idea. Correct me if I'm wrong, but those Australian projects have done that in a way. A lot of those are large-scale developments of that idea.
I would say they're like half a block size. They're not that big. And they're in existing exurban or suburban neighborhoods outside of Melbourne. This firm's called Bent Architecture. You can look it up if you want. I mean, they've done a lot of just pretty typical stuff too. Nicely done, but typical programs. But I think that would be a really interesting sort of prototype. You could call it a kind of a socially engaged suburbia model, or kind of utopian, and a kind of blank slate. Again, one of the motivations for me was to try and look at particularly aging suburbs, this kind of housing stock that's now 50, 60, 70 years old, and sort of not build new, because A, it's far away from the city, it's usually even further out, and B, I think it's more ecologically plausible, and C, there are all these examples of new residents coming in and transforming the built environment. It's really, I think, those were things that were sort of motivating me to look at it in this particular way, to frame the research in this particular way. But I do think that it might be interesting to do a kind of blank slate. I think another way to do it would, let's say, buy 2 back-to-back houses, it's on one street and another street, and then just start doing different things, and it's almost like popcorn in a particular neighborhood, begin to experiment in different ways too. And that might actually be more affordable because you already have the infrastructure there serving it, and it's connected to all sorts of important institutions like school systems and other government systems that we need to have.
I'm thinking also of adaptive reuse of the shopping malls.
Oh yeah, no,
as a possible site.
I mean, the mall in Westminster there, the Asia Garden Mall, is really interesting because they really inserted a series of public programs, right? They have a temple, they have this kind of performance space in the back, community performance space. They have this parking lot they see as a kind of public square that does many different things. So it's not just a kind of privately owned kind of retail pseudo-public space. It's really operating as a public space. And of course, the businesses and everything like that are also very small scale, often family owned as well. It's a really interesting energy.
Well, we can take another question before we stop, if anyone has one.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you so
Larry,
much.
thank you very, very much. Congratulations.